My name is Jessie Redd. I'm the interim director of the Safe Communities Institute here at USC. We are housed in the Price School of Public Policy. For those of you who are not familiar with SCI, the Safe Communities Institute, we pretty much focus on violence prevention, and we do that through education, research, and community engagement. So we were introduced to Dr. Fischer earlier this year, and she is from John Jay College over in New York, and she's just doing incredible work, so we invited her to come speak to you all. So I'm going to let her self-introduce and just tell us a little bit about her book, and please, if you have any questions, we're going to do Q&A towards the end of the event, so don't be shy. But without further ado, thank you so much, Dr. Fischer, for being here. Thank you, everyone.
So wonderful to have you all here. So I am what I call an interdisciplinary social scientist. So I'm a associate professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. It's a CUNY school in New York City, and I actually work in interdisciplinary studies, but my background is in social welfare and youth justice specifically. So I come to this work from working inside jails with young people that are incarcerated and running mental health programs for young folks. Hi, welcome. You can have a seat. And you'll hear this, and I'll be asking you more questions as I go through the book talk, is that this is really about grounding interventions in real people's experience. So people that are actually police officers who are in neighborhoods where they're dealing with homicides, with gun violence, right? And folks who are living in neighborhoods and are dealing with aggressive policing tactics and trauma from generational experiences of aggressive policing tactics. So it's this is ethnographic work, it's phenomenological work, so it really stems from an understanding and a knowing from the community of folks that are actually experiencing this phenomena. And so it's really, I'd love to hear from you as we go through about your experiences as well, because the only way to address what's happening in our communities is for us all to come from our varied perspectives and bring our experience with what the challenges are and also with the solutions. So thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful. So as I said, I came to this work from working inside jails, and I was very struck by how youth were pushed off a cliff without a parachute when leaving detention. So here I am running mental health programs. I have over 50 youth on my caseload at this long-term detention facility at the youth jail. This was in San Francisco County. I had about 100 young people on my caseload. So think about the setup for everybody. And it was my responsibility to get folks into the appropriate school settings, to find appropriate housing, right? And so after getting an ulcer from kind of the vicarious trauma of the experience, I decided I needed to do the work in a new way and started developing interventions for young people to keep young people out of jail, right? And moved to New York City and was doing this in Brooklyn, New York, and throughout Kings County, as well as in Westchester County. And worked very closely with different municipal health and human services, and really looked at the most innovative models to keep young people out of jail and to create stability in communities for families and young folks. And then got very interested in policy work and started working in the Governor's Office of Public Safety in New York State across all the different public safety departments, and did youth justice policy. So was shutting jails down, was working with the jurisdictions with the highest rates of violent crimes and detention, and again, coming up with innovative ways with young folks who are in the system, with folks working in the system, community members, grassroots organizations, to really either shut down jails or come up with ways of creating stability and success for our young folks. So this intervention in particular is very interesting because what I realized after doing the work, developing the programs, was we need to stop this at the front end, right? I was working with young people when they were in jail and seeing the conditions of confinement, the dehumanizing conditions. I was with young people, I was just sharing this before with Derek, who were on a 23-1, meaning that they were 23 hours in a cell and 1 hour out, and I would be doing therapy in this 8x8 cell with young folks that sometimes were detained there for over a 2-year period of time, and was very struck, again, by that, the dehumanizing nature of that experience. and really, again, wanted to figure out ways that we could stop the dehumanization of our young people and actually provide the services that young folks need, and realize that the front end, right, with police is a really critical intervention place. So I just want to hear from folks, what did you need as a young person to be successful? How did you get to where you are today? So just a brainstorm of what did you need?
Education.
Excellent. Education. Role models. Wonderful. Structure. Excellent. Say it again, I'm sorry? Teachers. Safety. And how would you define that? Safe home. Home. I heard family. Resources. What kind of resources?
Anything from clubs and sports, schools.
Yes.
Access to like resources to go to college.
Yes. So college readiness, college trips, right? College prep, because we know some public schools and private schools prepare you better for college than others, depending on where you live, right? So clubs, sports, college prep, college readiness. Hi, welcome. Have a seat. Hi, thanks for coming. So we have education, teachers, role models, structure, safety, having good supportive home and families, clubs, sports, right? College readiness. Say it again? Community. And how would you define that?
Well, that's hard. I'm still working. Well, ideally, neighborhoods, local community, community centers.
Excellent.
School community.
Yes. So local resources, and we'll talk about this more throughout this talk today, right, that are culturally affirming, that are reflective of the needs of the young people, that are accessible, that are local, right, that youth can get to without too much transportation issues, right, or safety issues, right, if you're dealing with turf territory. So excellent. Wonderful. Anything else you'd add? So I want you to be thinking about this throughout this talk today, because it's a critical part of this intervention, is thinking about putting ourselves in the shoes of young folks and thinking about what we needed in order to get to where we are today, how we got to where we are today, and then being able to extrapolate that to what young folks who are in the youth justice system also need. Wonderful. Okay. So we also know that in terms of that front-end relationship, that although law enforcement has disproportionate contact with 16 to 25-year-olds, they only receive 0.007% training in how to work with young adults, right? And we know the majority of law enforcement training is tactical, right? So the idea that we expect law enforcement to be dealing with issues around child welfare, around homelessness, around mental health issues and substance use, and what we see, and we'll talk about that as well on a daily basis happening in our communities, right, is a setup for everybody in a lot of ways. And I'm going to talk about today how this intervention can really, has really helped ameliorate those tensions that are caused by the inappropriate expectations that we may have of law enforcement, and how to partner with law enforcement in ways that actually create safety for everybody, a shared vision of safety, right, for the community and for law enforcement. What do you see happening in your communities between young people and law enforcement? What do you observe? It can be in the USC community. It can be in your own community. I know I live in Altadena, and I see no law enforcement around where we live. It's unincorporated, it's county, so I very rarely see any. I see lots of fire trucks, because we're in a fire zone. But anybody, what do you see? What do you see happening between young people and police in your community or here? And it can be any experience. Yes, please.
I think at least some of the things that I've noticed are a shift in cultural norms of maybe what values and expectations we had of young people 40, 50 years ago different than today. And I think some of the law enforcement training hasn't kept up with that change. Mm-hmm. And then I think a big portion of this is also because of implicit bias.
Excellent. And we'll be talking more about implicit bias and norms. So that's really wonderful. Thank you for bringing both of those concepts up. Anybody else? Yes, please. Hi. Say it again? Performative activism, what does that mean? How would you define that? That's an excellent, excellent point. So not really getting to the root of what the issues are, not having a substantive relationship, right, and actually committing to some kind of new policies and practices over a long period of time. That's an excellent point, right? So performative activism, right? So maybe something for just the media to say, hey, look, we are changing, but not actually making substantive policy and practice changes. Excellent, excellent point. Any other thing? What do you actually see? If any scenarios that folks can pinpoint? Yes?
Yeah, so I saw both what she calls performative activism. Neighborhood council I was part of was extending invitations to the local police department to come and introduce themselves, and there were coffee meetings with the police and all that. But when it came to interventions, so there were a lot of, including helicopters, interventions where it was a lot but involving Hispanic population. Now I don't know the age groups, I didn't directly see that, but I saw directly where there were guns involved and multiple police cars, and so a lot of it had to do with Hispanic people, Hispanic background.
So what you saw, where you are, you've seen, you see more interventions. You see police, law enforcement, and Latinx community members. Okay. So I was living in North Hollywood before, and I also saw a lot of helicopters, and police told us they did not get out of the cars there. It's just not a norm to get out of the car. So that kind of community policing model, I just moved from Brooklyn, New York, that's being normed again in New York City, was not the norm there. So that was interesting. And you talk about shifting cultural norms. And it's a wonderful model. And again, it speaks to what this model is. It's about having interactions that are humanized, right? Assessing our own biases in a situation and the real threat, and being able to assess that, right? And then acting from a place of respect and integrity and humanizing, right, the person in the interaction. So it sounds like you did a very good job at that, and very interesting what the response was, right? And that's something we'll be talking about. So as I shared, there's even though the population that law enforcement has the most contact with is young people from 16 to 25, there is very limited or no training with this population. And we know, right, from folks that were recently adolescents, as ourselves, parents of adolescents, that it's very normal to take risks. It's very normal, right, to take a stand, to be activists, right? And we need to create safe environments for our young people to be able to take risks in positive ways and supportive ways. So I was very struck. The Youth Police Initiative is an intervention that I started observing back in 2004, actually. And it was started in 2001 at the North American Family Institute, which is a national nonprofit. And it's a community, place-based approach targeted to the needs of specific neighborhoods and the police that are actually on the beat in that community. So it really matters what the needs are of the young folks and what the needs are of the officers in that particular locale. I'm sure y'all know, you're probably from all over the LA area, that every neighborhood is different, right? The cultural needs, the resources available across, again, we talked about public schools and private schools and so on. So it's really critical that it's not about a cookie cutter approach that's evidence-based and that can fit, that you have to have fidelity in order for it to work. It's actually really about the place itself, and then the skeleton of the intervention has proven to be very effective, and we'll talk about that. So the participants are young folks that have the most police contact. So it has occurred in over 31 cities and 3 different countries, and it's been in cities where you have the highest homicide rates, the highest rates of gun violence, the highest reported rates of violent crime, and I'm saying that because that, as we know, has to do with police surveillance and how many police are in a particular area as well. I've done some interesting comparative studies in New York City about just bicycle tickets and riding a bike on a sidewalk in Park Slope, which is now a pretty affluent neighborhood, even though a lot more people ride bicycles. There was 4 bicycle and sidewalk tickets over a 3-month period, and in Brownsville, where you have highest concentration of public housing in New York City, and you have issues around turf territory and gun violence, there were 450 bicycle sidewalk tickets over the same 3-month period, right? So really, again, understanding what's the context of a community is really important. So again, this is with young people who have been involved in gun violence, who have are coming out of jail, are on probation, have daily police contact. So young people who really know, right, who are experts in what law enforcement do in their own communities. And then it's law enforcement that are on the beat with young people, so actually have the daily contact with young folks. It's really critical. And just so you know, all the photos are actually from the Youth Police Initiative interventions. This one was in Milwaukee, the one before was Spokane, Washington. So again, it's happened all over the country, and in Bermuda and Belize, actually, the two other places. And then London is talking to the purveyors right now. The Metropolitan Police are really interested. So immediate goals and long-term goals: establish trust, increase mutual understanding, break down stereotypes, address implicit bias, right? That's a wonderful point you made here. Model and practice leadership and public speaking, develop action plans for sustained positive change, which you were saying back there about it not just being performative, right? It actually being substantive. And then long-term goals: it has shown to reduce arrests and decrease violence where folks have committed to the intervention over time, right? That's an important piece. So it's a vocational employment leadership training for both the young people and the officers. The young people are selected in partnership with different community-based organizations. It can be grassroots. They partnered with probation departments. In Florida, they're really fighting with the governor there to get funding. It's been very challenging, but all of Polk County looks like they're going to start, and that's with young people coming out of jail and their probation department. So again, it's happened in public housing developments, in lots of schools that are for like last chance schools for young folks or young people that have been in the system and then are going back into public education. So youth are actually paid as trainers. They're paid $100, so it's a vocational experience. And then training is either 5 sessions for 2.5 hours or 6. They just launched it online 2 years ago, so I evaluated how that worked. It was actually exciting to see that the findings were comparable. The positive findings were comparable to the in-person. So for the first 3 days of the intervention, the participants are young people. There's one community officer that the young people identify as that's the cool officer. So in Brownsville, Brooklyn, my book is really a deep ethnographic and phenomenological dive into how this worked in Brooklyn, New York, and Brownsville, and then in Boston at Franklin Field. So Boston is a public housing, in Boston, Franklin Field is a public housing development where it was called Murder Corridor back in 2007, and DOJ was brought in because the homicide rate was off the charts. And there was a captain there, Captain Torgen, who was really committed to stopping the revolving door of arrest. He's like, it was all about turf war and about trafficking of substances. And he's like, we just keep arresting the same people. And they go back into jail and they come out and they do the same thing because there's nothing new, right? And then there was a community organization and a tenants association that really wanted to change how policing was done and what was happening in their community. So again, when you look at the book, and it will start referring to pages if you feel like reading along at any point, but it's really about the amazing commitment of progressive police leaders like you have here, and of community organizations that want to see success for their young people. So it breaks down stereotypes in the second day, practice public speaking, explore the effects of choices, interactive exercises about bias and stereotypes, and throughout, the young people are talking about their experiences with officers in their neighborhood, like what's actually happening, what are the scenarios that are real to this community. So again, this happens with one community officer that the youth identify, and it's 10 to 15 youth depending, and then there's 2 trainers that are trained in conflict resolution. The woman right now who's doing the training is amazing. She's done training with the UN in Rwanda, in Israel-Palestine, and also in gang territories in the US. She's really, really phenomenal. So the participants on day 4, you have a group of officers that then come in. The officers meet separately with the trainers and talk about their perceptions and stereotypes of the young people that they are working with. And then they learn a little bit about adolescent development. And then the youth come into where the officers are and tell their stories, right? And talk about who they are, what their life has been like, what's happening with them in terms of housing and school and what their goals are. And you can just see the tension melt, right? When the officers hear about the young people's experience. There's a name for it in psychology called narrative therapy, but when really hearing the experiences of young people and remembering what it was like, right, to be a young person, the officers have a whole new perception of the young people. And then the officers tell their story. They do a lifeline and share why they became police officers, right, and what their backgrounds were like. And then you already hear all these similarities that emerge just from that initial introduction. I observed a YPI in Mount Vernon, New York. I'm sure you know, Larry, about Mount Vernon. And it was all female officers, and it was mostly black female officers and black young women in a second chance school in Mount Vernon. And just in this first hour when they met each other on day 4, they started talking about child sexual abuse and incest and shared experiences growing up in Mount Vernon and challenges they had experienced. And they all were crying by the end of this first day together. And this was back now in like 2006, and they've sustained the relationship that they developed through this intervention, and it has changed, right, how they interact with each other in that community. So it's creating a sense of community, team building, addressing stereotypes and biases. Day 5 is engaging in activities and discussion about social media and how that affects our perceptions of each other. I'm sure folks have a lot to say about that in here. And an introduction to the scenarios and action plan. So as I was saying, in that first couple of days, the youth are discussing the real life scenarios. So they do role plays with the officers, right? And that the youth are facilitating, demonstrating what actually happens in the community. So I'm sure in LA, this is very similar. Car stops are one of the biggest issues that are mentioned by police officers as being the most dangerous things for officers to encounter. So the last one that I was observing, there was in Brownsville, Brooklyn, there was a car stop scenario, right? And so the police was sharing why it's so dangerous, and one officer had been run over during a car stop. So, and the youth were like, what? And just hearing the officer talk about what that was like to be run over during a car stop and how scary that was for the officer. And then the youth talked about feeling harassed during car stops and being pulled over and cops not believing that that's your car because of where they live and what they look like, and just the constant refrain of being harassed because you fit the description. So having the youth talking about that to the officers and saying, this is how I would like to be communicated with in this interaction. So that's day 6. So this is the intervention is grounded in field theory, which is Kurt Lewin in the 1940s was a social psychologist, and he basically asserted that people that live in the same environment, right, are affected by forces that are similar in their immediate fields, and that behavior and its analysis is a function of interacting in and surviving the existing environment. And Interdependent Fates, which you'll see in the title of my book, is a tenet of field theory, and it's about how disparate groups, like young people and police, are actually inextricably tied together, and that one's fate depends upon the fate of both groups, sparking motivation to share responsibility for the entire group's welfare. So Lewin theorized and tested that when members are dependent on each other for achievement, a powerful dynamic is created. I mean, I'm very excited to hear, because this is problematic in a lot of ways. I think it works in a lot of ways, but I'm excited to hear when we get to discussion. So that's also informed by intersectionality and Kimberly Crenshaw's theory, the legal scholar, that it's critical to understand how and when people experience discrimination in the criminal justice system may be different depending on the race, ethnicity, language, gender, locale, sexuality. In Brownsville, Brooklyn, when I asked the young men, is there anything that you think about your identity that makes the contact with police more challenging, that makes you feel like you're being targeted? Because young people talked about persistent harassment on a daily basis. Even after I get off the radar, supposedly because I've served my time, I'm still getting stopped, I'm still getting frisked, I'm still getting harassed. The young people said more than gender and race, it was locale. It was living in Brownsville. It was living in the Brownsville 5, which is the public housing development there, more so than being black and being a young man. And it was the same in Franklin Field, Boston, talking to folks retrospectively about this intervention. It was living in Franklin Field and feeling like they were being targeted and surveilled in that area. So I'm just, in terms of intersectionality, just grounding myself. I'm a queer woman, an out queer woman, and had an experience with police brutality in Chicago with my partner, where we were called racial and epithets and excuse my language, dyke and so on, and they threatened us with a gun. They pulled a gun out. This was just from trying to park our car and having the person behind us had to wait because it was a one-way street. And so just the history of understanding the context of homophobia within law enforcement. There was a history of sumptuary laws. Anybody know what those are? They were actually laws they were nullified in 1980, but they were about, the police were able to stop you if you were not wearing the clothes that were assigned to your gender. And they were able to arrest you for that. And even though it was nullified in 1980, 400 people were still arrested under the laws through 2003. So again, just understanding, having an intersectional understanding of how discrimination may be different, right, for folks, depending on their identity. Theory of knowing, so this is my own kind of epistemological journey around this work, and we'll talk about this more, but phenomenology, meaning that this is grounded in the experience of young folks, right, that are living in neighborhoods that are highly policed, and the police officers that work on the beats with young people. So when youth knew the officers, right, and said officers are cool, it really changed the dynamic. When youth understood where the officers were coming from, it really changed the dynamic. Okay, so the methodology we talked about, ethnography, phenomenology. So participatory action research is really critical. You can see on page 5 and 69 in the book, but it's really about, again, ensuring that the folks who are being affected by the particular issue that you're researching, that you're focusing on, are part of the every aspect of the research, right? So the inquiry, the data collection, the analysis, right? There were also quantitative pre-post surveys they were actually field tested by the OJJDP and validated and administered online in person. And then I used both qual and quant data in my analysis and interpretation. So this is just an example of the youth survey items. And this is the police survey items. Being respectful is nearly impossible when dealing with a teen perpetrator. I know how to talk to a teen. Right? I love the one there's one that's about how I was like this teenager. Teens in the neighborhood I patrol are different than I was at the same age, right? And it's interesting to see how that changes. So again, this has been in 31 cities in 3 countries. Over 5,000 youth have participated, over 3,000 officers. These were questions that youth asked during this PAR phase, this participatory action phase around looking, what did police want to know from cops? And this is what the young people wanted to know, right? So why do cops shoot to kill is a very interesting one. Why do rookie cops from outside the neighborhood seem more dangerous? How are cops trained and for what purpose? Great question. So these were all from the young people who are in the system. We're dealing with daily harassment. We've already talked about this theme of persistent harassment. This was a quote from a young person that really expresses that theme. Officers just stop people for no reason. They abuse their authority. They stop you because of the way you look or what you're doing. You could just be minding your business. I could be just walking up the block and they could stop me, talking about what am I doing, where am I coming from. And this is before the intervention, right? So these are the questions that youth had for officers before YPI, and then the pre-themes. These are from interviews, focus groups, and from write-in answers on the surveys. Police from the neighborhood are cool. I can't say all of them, but you got some of them that grew up in the projects, and that's officers that know what's going on. That's the cool officers. Then you got officers that don't know the situation, and they look at us, oh, this project's, they're the worst, so they do what they do. So again, the youth feeling like they're being stereotyped and targeted for being in this particular neighborhood. So again, the themes that came up from the young people, constant harassment, you fit the description, fear on both sides, rookie cops are scared of us and shoot out fear, acute and generational trauma from police violence. So it's not just the experience that young people had, it's the experience that their uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, like their family members overall. So hearing the stories of the aggressive policing tactics, so even if a young person hadn't had a negative experience, it absorbed, right, the experiences of their community members. So consequence of arrest, profound public humiliation and loss. The young people talked about that over and over. It's so embarrassing. He pulled me over. I'm in college now and I got pulled over still. Why am I still getting pulled over, right? And then everybody on the street seeing, because Brownsville, where this theme stemmed from as well, it's a small community. So he's like, my auntie saw, right? The person who I'm working for at my job saw, so the public humiliation of the harassment. I slept so many different ways, the dehumanizing process from arrest to jail. Cops from the community and OGs are cool. And then there was an understanding, and we talked about this earlier, that there's a cultural shift happening and that there were policy changes happening. This was data was collected between like 2018 and 2020, and there was shifts around the quality of life laws and how young people were being treated during arrests related to quality of life. So for the police, before the Youth Police Initiative, the police felt like everybody in the neighborhood thought they were the bad guys. Maybe sometimes it was a bad incident, just a particular individual or particular household. They just don't like police. So police were coming in with this feeling of already, they don't like me. I'm not safe here. I am not liked. People don't want me here. So coming in feeling defensive, feeling threatened. And then, as I already shared, there was this one officer in Brooklyn was from the public housing development. And he talked about how when you live in a housing complex, you don't have a backyard. So the public space is hanging out in the front courtyard, right? And in the summer, a lot of units don't have AC, so they heat up, and that causes people to go outside. So one thing I would do if I was like in charge, I'm not the mayor or anything like that, but you've got to put more ACs in the housing units, right? So that would have been a simple environmental intervention, because folks were getting arrested outside for gathering, right, for unlawful loitering. Which is, and assuming that in New York, if it's more than 3 people, you can make the assumption that it may be a gang-related loitering. And so folks were getting arrested in front of this development for that charge. So after YPI, so there was a change from pre to post. For the youth, the police really care about what is good for the neighborhood, increased by 200% from disagree to agree. So before they didn't think cops cared, afterwards it was a significant change. I know at least one police officer who I can trust changed significantly, right? 214%, it changed the most to strongly agree. After YPI, the change in the youth perceptions of the police changed. There was a theme that came up around mutual respect. They made me feel like we could get along. I feel like all cops are not the same, and they have different attitudes and personalities. Almost a paradigm shift. I look at a police officer a little different and understand where they're coming from. Honestly, hearing what a real police officer said cleared up a lot or little about how and why they are so annoying with us. Another theme was behavior change. You don't have to act crazy when approached by cops. That we talked about this, car stops, domestic violence are the 2 most dangerous things that officers have to deal with. So for the police after YPI, right, it's a waste of taxpayer money for police officers to spend time talking with teens. Changed 140%, right, from neutral to disagree. So cops felt like it actually was worth their time, because that's a lot of the issues that can come up in precincts. Oh, I don't want to have to go to the stupid training. What is the point of it? I have so much that I need to do already. Why are you making me do this? So cops really felt like it was worth their time, and it was a worthwhile experience. I don't feel confident when communicating with teenagers shifted significantly from neutral to strongly disagree. So all the items changed, and these are just some of the highlights. After YPI, the police perceptions of youth changed. The theme that came up is we need more time with the youth. So the officers enjoyed, just observing the officers and the youth playing together, because the officers come in their full gear with guns and billy clubs. And some of the YPIs that I've observed, it's been the arresting officer with the young person in the same training together. And they're doing trust falls and all sorts of untangling from a human knot. And again, with the guns and billy clubs. It's very interesting. It was good. I just wish we had more time with the kids. We did listen to them. We're all going to get a basketball tournament. So that speaks to what you talked about in terms of performative action. And that's, again, you'll see, and if you read the book, that when that may have happened, but also how this can be used for something to be more substantive, to be a door to more sustained positive relations. Open communication. Kids spoke about how they really feel. You don't get that from them, right? It seemed like they were more free, like they felt comfortable. Young people understood why we do what we do. Productive dialogues, role-playing scenarios. Now others understand why we do the things we do. This is Franklin Field. So after YPI, the themes between the youth and police knowing youth makes a difference. Transparent, respectful communication prevents harassment and violence. Police need to tell youth why they are being stopped. Being aware of body language. Right, conscious of hands during car stops. So during that training that I was referring to with the scenario with the car stop, with the role play, that same youth actually was in a car stop during the week of the training, right? And then came back and said, I kept my hands on the wheel and he let me go. I was respectful. I asked the officer exactly why I was being stopped. The officer explained it to me, and I got out of that situation without a ticket, with my car, without being killed. So just to see it in action was really interesting. Positive activities between youth and police improve relations. Youth are leaders, spread the word. So I think the officers were really struck by all of the genius. They had made assumptions about the young people in the community, and then hearing this young person is in college, this young person wants to go to college, this young person is the first person in their family to go to college. I was the first person in my family to go to college, right? So having that shared understanding and that identification, again, really humanizes the relationship. And the next time you see somebody, if you know their name, you're much less likely to arrest them or use aggressive tactics, right? It really transforms how you interact with that person after you have a positive interaction. Environmental conditions criminalize behaviors. That was really clear from both the youth and police afterwards, a clear understanding of that. Facilitated dialogue between developments alleviates tensions. Parent and community involvement is key. Positive activities that meet the needs of kids are a must. So the officers really agreed afterwards, wait, young people just need cooler things to do so they're not involved in turf wars. They have a place to actually make money legitimately that, again, is culturally affirming, that actually supports the young person's goals, that isn't going to criminalize a young person and call them delinquent or other horrible racist or other biased terms. So after YPI, a young person, Nathaniel, said, you don't usually get to speak your mind with officers. They don't want to hear. They heard us. That was very surprising that the communication was there. And then Officer Perez said, I always knew that a lot of youth had it rough and had it rough with cops, but I never heard it to this extent. I can only imagine what it's like to leave your house and think, shit, I'm going to get stopped 15 times, right? It sucks. So after YPI, and we only got a couple more slides, and then I would love to have a discussion about what you think about this. So I talked about Boston, Franklin Field already, and in the book you'll see that chapter 3, page 45 is all an in-depth case study of how this worked in Franklin Field. And after 12 years of youth police initiative, and there is now programs, counseling, outreach. There's a culinary program, a computer program, educational and tutoring. Boston College, their social work school, provides the counseling. Venus and Serena actually came and did a tennis program there. They have cookouts. There's a teen center that the officers helped build. So the officers realized that, as I showed in the theme, that the youth actually needed a safe place to go. And one of the reasons why youth were getting involved in turf wars and dealing, because they, again, didn't have a safe place to be and work on computers and focus on school and get tutoring and get counseling and get their needs met, like all of us, right, did and needed to do as young folks. And the officers helped build this teen center in Franklin Field housing development. And again, it took leadership from community members and from the police department, grassroots organizations, to really come together to say, wait, we need this to stop. We need to stop this revolving door, the collateral damage from arrests, right, from incarceration. We need to stop this. And then they also built a senior center in the last 5 years, which is really exciting because the seniors also felt scared in their homes and wanted a safe place to be. And then they've been able to build relationships now with the teen center, and it's been a really lovely intergenerational connection. So in White Plains, New York, the negative contacts with police and youth, this is also a public housing development, were reduced significantly over a 3-year period. There were reductions in arrests and overall negative police contacts and violence. And there was a huge reduction in complaints about police, the citizen complaints about police, and a reduction in crime. So the recommendations that, and this is just highlights, you'll see in the last chapter, there's very extensive literature review to support all these different recommendations. I did meta-analysis of different interventions. You'll see all that fun, wonky academic exploration there. Rapid youth referral. This is an intervention that I'm evaluating right now in Brooklyn, New York. It was started by Michael K. Williams, who folks know, the actor that passed away recently. He was on The Wire, had a scar on his face, really amazing. He started an organization called Build the Block, and it's for young people with felonies and gun charges in Brownsville and now in Sheepshead Bay, and now it's going throughout Brooklyn and now New York City. It's being replicated. But it's actually having restorative justice peace circles for young people to talk about the violence and why it's happening. Exalt is an organization that's part of this Rapid Youth Referral, which is an education organization that helps youth get their math and reading scores up to grade level. A lot of young people who have been in the system, either child welfare or youth justice, have third grade reading and math levels. So getting folks to a place academically where they can actually take the high school equivalency test or go to college, and they've had tremendous results. Their recidivism rate is incredibly low. But it's been and it's really connecting youth with culturally affirming and positive activities and that replace the violence that the youth were involved in. Asset mapping, you can look at the gaps in services in a community, or you can so you can categorize by educational, recreational, what's culturally affirming, what's not culturally affirming, vocational, employment opportunities, and you can look at a whole neighborhood, right? Substance use services, mental health services, and find out which ones are viable and are doing a good job and have good facilities, right, for young people. And it's actually a way that cops can train their cadets on what the strengths are of a community. So in New York City, and I would love to hear what this is like in LA, they would use Brownsville and East New York as basic training for rookie cops coming in from Long Island. And these were white, working class cops coming in who had never been around black folks and were coming into Brownsville and just kind of thrown into the job without really understanding the community, understanding the context of the community. So when the youth are saying it's rookie cops that shoot, I'm very scared of rookie white cops in particular. Asset mapping really helps new recruits see where the strengths are, and also folks that have been right in the precinct a long time who may have a more negative bias about the community. But communities all have wonderful kinship networks and underground grassroots networks and networks that are very above ground that folks just don't know about. So this is now happening. And there's a wonderful captain, St. Fort. There was a great New York Times article written about him. And he's the one that helped spearhead this. And he has a relationship with this nonprofit organization so that when a youth is at risk, instead of sending his officers to arrest, they call him directly in his office directly as community youth officers and say, hey, we're going to get you into the RYR. So the youth don't even know that it's going through the police department. They have no idea that this is even connected to the police department because this captain knows that it won't look legitimate to the young folks because their trauma is so profound in this community. With police, he knows it has to be done outside. So he will tell the head of this nonprofit and say, hey, Johnny's about to get arrested. We're worried about him. We've seen him out there. He's got caught with a gun, but I'm referring him to, if you can get him now and get him into the rapid youth referral, then, right, we won't arrest him. We won't prosecute. So it's really, really interesting. So again, in partnerships with folks that are really going to meet the needs, right, of our young people. We talked about what we needed. Motivational interviewing and harm reduction, that's training cops in how to really interact with young people on the street and find out what they need and what their goals are so the interaction actually seems positive and the officers are approaching young people as service providers instead of as somebody who's trying to control and contain and punish and hurt. So it changes the dynamic and it gives police tools on how to do that. So how to de-escalate. There's been a lot of research about college for cops, and again, if it has a service orientation to it, so cops when they take classes in counseling, it does show a positive effect in terms of community policing standards. Positive police performance measures. The youth talked about that a lot, the cops talked about that a lot, how the police are being promoted, right? So that can be a setup for the community. If police are not being assessed and their performance isn't being rated based on the positive interactions they're having, if it's still being assessed based on arrests, right, and on tickets, and in New York, the desk appearance tickets are given for quality of life laws, and now people are getting arrested again for those. That's critical. We have to change the policies that affect police officers and how they get validation for doing their job, right? That has to change as well. Trauma-informed policing, there's some wonderful examples of this. Val Demings down in Florida, who's now running for legislature, you may be familiar with her. She was a chief of police in Orlando, and she had her officers go door to door in a public housing development there that was the axis for a lot of gun violence, and ask people what they needed. Her line officers just went door to door. Hey, what's going on? Your water's been running nonstop, and so you can't be in your house. So you're concerned because you're not safe in your own home. So let's help connect you with maintenance and so on. Just very simple things that may not seem that obvious, but when you actually ask people what they need, can really transform the relationship and allow for officers to have a more positive dynamic with the community. Being culturally informed and affirming, implicit bias training, we talked about that earlier. Phil Goff's shop, the Policing Equity Institute, does some great work around that. A lot has been happening around that. Again, how it gets implemented culturally, right, and where it's really happening, how it's happening. There's some amazing police leaders there. We know that it's the sergeants and it's the folks on the ground that really are the pedal to the metal. So how are we making culture shifts so that again, police can feel validated, right? There are police in New York City that felt like they were being shamed if they were doing more community-oriented policing by other cops, right? So how to address the cultural issues, redressing harms that have happened. So it's, I think, really critical that when these interventions, the YPI trainings are happening in places that are neutral, that youth see are safe, where youth have a voice. But it's very critical. You'll see on page 225, I go into more detail about that. Paulo Freire, who's a wonderful pedagogue who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, writes a lot about how the importance of, again, finding out from folks, what does safety really mean to you? And again, not projecting from our ivory tower what we think safety means. And then it just shows the themes that I already discussed with you that these recommendations connected with. So thank you so much for listening. I would love to hear any questions that you have. I have a video about how this worked in Franklin Field. I don't know if that's interesting to you, but I would love to hear any questions or discussion points that came up for you.
So if we're gonna sort of take on a historical lens, it's clear that police officers, ever since prior to the 19th century, have always carried on the role of sort of suppressing uprisings. And they've been basically tasked with the job of using threats to take care of such problems and to just use constraint and suppression. And it's clear that they're not able to properly carry out the tasks that, for example, a psychiatrist is responsible for, which is basically helping patients that are not, using force, whatnot. And there's only so much as to what law enforcement can do in terms of bettering community relations and just ultimately addressing issues in incarceration, racial profiling. So my question, is basically, do you personally believe that the role of police ought to sort of expand in the tasks that address social work?
Not necessarily. I think that what the research has shown is that the partnerships have been really successful. So there's been lots of pilots done over the last 10 years where there's partnerships with substance use organizations, with homelessness organizations, mental health organizations, doing mobile crisis and literally being on the beat with officers and intervening when an officer may do an arrest and instead bringing somebody to a resource that's viable in the community to get their actual needs met. So I think that it's not. I actually think that police officers, we should change how we do dispatch. That's my own thought, and that when dispatch receives a call, that we should get more information about what the context is, and officers should be trained on what that looks like. People need to know, right? But being able to detect, this is an issue with homelessness, this is substance use, this is mental health, and sending the right person. And then I think officers would be dealing with with what they're actually trained for, the tactical training, and much more acute situations where you have a gun involved. But even when there's a gun involved, I think that it would be helpful and it would prevent fatalities if there was more training around de-escalation as well, and not just tactical response.
And I also have a follow-up question, but basically there also have been efforts that have been enacted. For example, the mental health courts, where it's still the presence of law in trying to handle situations that shouldn't be there in the first place, because then the person in the court would need to be subjected to arrest in order to receive punishment.
Yes, excellent point.
And also, what's your take on that? How would you, with the information that you worked on, what do you think should be done in order to address that? Because it's clear that it's not solving the issue. There's also the war on drugs, and there's also other things that don't address housing or essential support services that people really need in order to stop having policing as one of their primary issues. What do you think should be done in response to issues such as that?
So I think one of the interventions that has shown success, as I discussed, is when the referral is made, again, to the appropriate social service before an arrest is made, right? So that you have these pilots that are happening and you have more policy shifting in precincts where the folks who are dealing with mental health or homelessness, right, are ostensibly being referred to the appropriate agency instead of being arrested first in order to get access through a mental health court or through another court. But it's an excellent point. And I think this is what this model is showing, is that it's opened the door to precincts and community members being more innovative in how they respond and taking kind of agency over their own discretion in the community and finding out what the resources are through asset mapping and other tools. But you're absolutely right. I think that's exactly the point that I told you about Captain St. Fort he was making. He doesn't want the young people to know that the police are involved at all, right, in this intervention. He wants to be able to tell the community-based organization, one of the young people in your organization is on our radar, or we have this young person who we're concerned about, we think you could help them, and then sends out the organization to interact with that young person to stop the arrest. Those are excellent questions. I really appreciate that.
In any of the jurisdictions that you had your data from, did you see a change, a paradigm shift in the performance metrics at the highest level, from either a city manager, a mayor, or downwards, so that the pressure for police officers not to give a ticket for youth sitting on some steps or a stoop? How do you see that the metrics have changed over the course of these initiatives?
So they have a graduation at the end, at the sixth session of this, and it's very rare that a mayor does not come in Kansas City, Missouri, in the eastern sector. The police chief, the mayor, in the third session, the police chief actually comes and talks to the young people and the officers and says, this is really important. We need to work together to create a shared vision of public safety. And so the organization, North American Family Institute, that runs this, does a lot of legwork in talking to community leaders, grassroots folks, and police leaders and municipal leaders. So mayors get involved, police chiefs get involved, police commissioners get involved. So they really try to, again, get stakeholders to the table who actually have power of the levers to change the protocols, whether they're formal or informal, right, in terms of how policing is done in that community. Yeah, but making actual policy change, I think, is that's right. That's the challenge, and making sure that the changes are made legislatively, and there's accountability.
I had a follow-up question about the youth who graduate from these programs, who have had interaction with law enforcement, have had interaction with possibly being within the system. Is there an extension of the program where their youth are now, I know you mentioned asset mapping, where they're actually connected to programs that they can then join as alternatives, or you also mentioned getting their education to the level that they needed, and just a more hands-on, tailored approach to that? Absolutely. So after that last session, the action plan is about that sustained growth. And in the places, at least that I was studying, they had a leadership program that was aftercare that went on for at least 2 years, if not longer, or they're partnering with organizations like Exalt, the one that I described to you, that does the college readiness and helps young people who have low credit, low average around their math and reading skills. So there's sustained connections with groups that can provide that long-term support to keep youth out of jail. Yeah, that have shown that kind of success. It's an excellent question and very important. And I think that's what's important, and it speaks to what you were saying earlier too, around this is a wonderful gateway to an action plan that's real for that particular community. Police leaders have to be committed. Community-based organizations have to be committed. You have to find out what the needs are and be able to meet those needs, right? It's not just a one-shot, and it's great. There's been changes that I've seen after it happening in one place, but really to sustain change over time, it's a wonderful, again, a great way to open the door to creating a safe space for those discussions, or an ostensibly safe space for those discussions. But it's really important to have sustained interventions that are paired. So the nonprofit that runs it does have community leadership programs. They're an $80 million nonprofit in 15 different states and have community-based interventions that go for the life of the child.
Could you talk a little bit about how the officers are selected for this? Because I would imagine that the problem officers are not the ones who would be
actually. That are the ones that are chosen. That's an excellent question, Mike.
So it's compulsory for the officers?
So yes, it's compulsory for the officer, so it's purposive sampling, meaning that it's very specifically chosen for the purpose of this intervention. So it's actually a mix of officers that have had the most citizen complaints and then officers that have really demonstrated what community policing is and what it means to partner with young people and to care about young people and empathize and humanize, right, your dynamic with a young person. So it's been really I've observed interventions where police start like this and are so resistant, and then by the end are running around, right, playing, basically, move my ass, sorry, it's the name of the game, but basically musical chairs with young people, right?
And are there metrics about whether their behavior on the street changes afterward?
I would love to be able to measure that. If you know of a good funding source, but that's an excellent question. I would love to measure that because, again, anecdotally, talking to officers in Boston, doing the retrospective study and talking to officers who have been involved, who had started out in 2007 very resistant and now are very involved, I can share that they have changed how they police, but I do not have the hard data to support it. It's all anecdotal at this point. That's an excellent question.
I had a follow-up question, kind of similar to the question that was asked in the front row, but this one's directed to the officer. I know that you mentioned that it's difficult, and I can totally see that, how it's difficult to get funding for, these follow-ups to see, what are the results that are coming out of program implementation, but also at the same time, and I don't know how the money's broken down, so not really sure where it's going, but we do see a trend, and we have seen a trend in the last 5-10 years that police are being funded more than ever before in the history of policing. And so where is all that money going if not to better these institutions, if not to follow up on these programs? If we're talking about we need more training for officers, we need more this and that to transform policing. Yeah. I don't know if you would know the answer to that question, but...
Well, all that I can say to the budgeting is it's available online. But labor costs for public, whether it be police or fire, public service labor costs are probably upwards of 90+% of an entire budget, and north of that. I do know that. So labor costs and generally public service industry is extremely expensive. For the officers themselves, the equipment, the cars, the gasoline, the helicopters, all of that. But we have made phenomenal strides in our training, the way our officers are training. They go through, I just had some officers go through a 4-day, we call it MHIT, but it's a mental staggered approach. So they spend 4 days. And how do you intervene with somebody in mental distress to have the best possible outcome? And then how do we connect those to other service providers? The other challenging point, I'll just finish with this, as you say with other service groups, is at 2 a.m, you have to ask, are those other service groups available? So police departments, fire departments, we're very forward-leaning, very forward, 365, 75 days a week. Who are you calling at 2 a.m. when you have a crisis? If you don't want the police to get there because it's not the right place for the police, there has to be someone else that's willing to be there on the spot to take that.
And that's a funding issue.
That is a real challenge in this whole discussion about what does public safety look like, and we want the police to do that or not like that, or they shouldn't intervene in there. Then who?
Exactly.
And it's a very complex social construct that we find ourselves in. And I think there's some things that we would like to be out of the business of, quite frankly.
Absolutely.
So very challenging. But the budget's online, but labor costs, equipment costs, building maintenance costs, very expensive for all of our organizations.
Right.
Having 24/7, I mean, there are mobile crises, but how police are connected to those interventions, right, and what the protocols are in place. Again, if we could use dispatch as a point of entry to be able to get the right services to the right people when there is a call. So at 3 a.m, if someone's dealing with homelessness or substance use or mental health, which I saw a lot out of my window in North Hollywood, right, getting the right folks to respond, it's really important.
And Eugene, Oregon has a great model for that. They call it
Yeah.
Cahoots.
Yeah.
So
What's the
they're
name?
the way they do. It's called Cahoots.
Oh, Cahoots.
But it's run out of Eugene, Oregon. The way they've, but it's a nonprofit that partnered with the police department is phenomenal.
Yeah.
The way they were able to do that, but a much smaller city. But they've done a phenomenal job there.
But I think what you just said, smaller city, the place-based model, as I talked about in different neighborhoods in Brooklyn that partnered with their nonprofit organizations with their mobile crisis, right, that you talked about, really showed tremendous success. There's a lead intervention you may be familiar with, which is officers partnering with folks in substance use intervention. Right, this is in Albany, New York, and it's Seattle and several different places, Vancouver, Washington, and it's shown tremendous success at assisting folks that are dealing with substance use on the street. So I think that model is really about taking it to scale, having the resources available to fund places to be 24/7 is really critical.
So to follow up on that, so you do the program, the youth changes their opinion, then, I don't know if this is what she was referring to, but the general attitude that you hear in the media, that you hear the negative, constant drumbeat about the police and certain things, how long does it take for those children or youth to change the attitude back to where they were after they finish the program?
And there has to be, as I was sharing with the Boston example, and even with what's happening right now in New York and in other places where this has been very successful, the mosque, for example, as well, it's really about the sustained commitment of that local precinct, of the community organizations, of the tenants organizations, of the the citizens that live there, and seeing that their needs are being met, and seeing officers do policing differently, using different tactics, building relationships, learning people's names, asking people what they need, connecting people to adequate resources, being human, humanizing the relationship. Exactly. Thank you. I'm going to hang out if you want to ask me any questions. It was so wonderful to have all you here. Thank you so much.